A little bit about me. So I have a background in innovation and as an engineering lead, as Jonathan said. But in more recent years, I've become more of one of these, to use the word Amaya said, maybe an evangelist around cloud, new ways of working, and transformation. And for my sins, I'm the founder and coordinator of Centrica's Guild Network that's been running a few years, and I also blog. So a little bit about Centrica itself. Centrica is a very large organization, quite diverse, multinational, and we have lots of different business units. I won't go through all of them, but we've got everything from, a very traditional parts of the business that are to do with, maybe the utility side of it, all the way to things like demand response services that are to do with, effectively helping electricity grid out by actually creating virtual power plants, by allowing companies like industrial corporations to turn their air conditioning off at certain times to lower the actual effect on the grid. We've also been building the largest battery in the UK. And we've also got various brands like Hive and Local Heroes that kind of work more in the kind of next generational space. So this gives us a number of challenges, and I've broken them down into 5. So the first thing that we've got the influence of maybe the mothership, or what we might call mode 1, over some of our decentralized businesses and teams. So some of them might be similar to, the Babylon Health type of organization that Amaya described, where it's a new, business venture working in a completely new way and, wall-to-wall agile. But also there's kind of a team that's trying to reduce cost of ownership and things like that across the board, and is maybe looking at it from a different dilemma. So there's kind of those two dynamics, those two mindsets, if you will, don't always play well together. There's also, because of this, an unevenness in terms of our cultures and skill sets. And in fact, people have talked about the fact that in some cases we might be at both ends of a capability maturity model around cloud or agile or something like that. Part of it is we don't really have an alternative operating model for everybody. We've got people, or that's what we're working on. We have people that are operating in a more formalized way, and then we've got other people that are fully agile, and we need to work out how do we accommodate both parties. So we have issues with understanding what's the value proposition for people to actually work together when they have these different mindsets. And again, as Amaya mentioned, there can be trust issues, as they are in a lot of large organizations. So how have we tackled this problem? Well, basically, the way we decided to tackle it was to actually imagine we'd already transformed in a way, and how could we emerge from our wider organization in this sort of transformational manner? How could we, be that butterfly emerging from the chrysalis? So we started organizing at the grassroots, and we formed a guild, and we didn't really ask permission. We just kind of cracked on with it. That's one of the things that's quite cool and exciting. So what is a guild? So basically, people may have heard of the Spotify model. There's a picture on the right. I see it maybe as a community of practice. It's largely run by the membership. It could be drawn from people from a number of silos. It's about forwarding the aims of that community. It's typically voluntary, and it can be facilitated rather than led. And it's maybe the emphasis on psychological safety. It's really, we could say things like the Spotify guilds that Jonathan mentioned, but also, British Medical Association is a type of guild. You could say it's even similar to a union in some respects, in as much as it gives a kind of a collective voice to a group of people, particularly at the grassroots. So how do we operate? Well, our guilds typically meet once a week. We've got teams, so we meet over Teams, but we've also got Teams chat. And we've got about 450 members, with about 10 to 20% of those active at any one time. So before guilds, maybe the way we're organized tended to be more formal, hierarchical and transactional. And that meant, this is a cartoon, well-known Bonkers World cartoon about how different organizations really operated. And to some extent, we had some of the downsides and upsides of all of these organizations, where different parts of the organization didn't really see eye to eye. You've got people that maybe thought that they were the decision makers, but they didn't have accountability for the outcome, and other people that thought that didn't work for them, and other people that were more about risk taking, other people that were maybe more about trying to reduce risk and optimize things. So there's a wide variety, and actually Simon Wardley talks about this with his, accidental empires view of pioneers, settlers, and town planners. And it's well known that those groups don't always get on. So after the guilds, we really managed to change this, and I'll explain how we did it. But basically, we managed to create. We created people talking to each other. They were flat, informal, collegiate, and even sociocratic. And this is, I don't know if anybody's come across holacracy or sociocracy, but really this was around the principle of consent and equivalence. The guilds were really about involving people at the grassroots in the decision-making process, rather than it being enforced from above. So really the simple idea is that we realized that jobs, pay grades, and egos got in the way of the organization. So we left them at the door. And we really emphasized the mutuality of the membership and the group sense making over actually getting the work done. And in the short term, that meant we got less work done. But in the longer term, it meant we built trust. And building that trust meant that we were really using, these idea of some of these soft skills around psychology, but even network science, in terms of actually networking in a way where we were breaking the silos down, where we're actually able to transform more quickly. So in some ways, we were acting a little bit like a trim tab, which are these little bits on a kind of a control surface on an airplane or a boat or something, that just it makes it easier to actually make a change by making a kind of a little change that keeps the change in place. So it's really like the guilds. We could act as if the organization had already transformed, and by transformation we might be talking about the agile, but also digital, even decentralization. So it's basically like growing an ideology, and it's very effective. And really, just to riff on that point, this is a slide from Meeting Magic about Frederic Laloux's Reinventing Organizations, which is quite a famous but a few years old now. It's talking about different types of organizations. And maybe if you could say that our host organization is achievement orange, we could say that what we're able to do within the guilds, as soon as people enter guild space, we can actually act like an evolutionary teal or pluralistic green or an evolutionary teal organization. So it's really about saying that when we go to a guild, actually we're already transformed. We have a slightly different culture, and it's maybe a more transformational culture, and that can accelerate the wider transformation of the whole organization. So how did this come apart? Well, actually, just to kind of disclose a little bit myself. So I have bipolar, and that means I have, manic depression. So funny enough, this was to some extent came out of my experience with group therapy. So I learned through group therapy that you could actually have like a group of people where it's all about psychological safety and kind of exploring people's perspectives. So I kind of had that in mind, that when I was actually working with these guilds. So it really started off in 2017, where there was like 3 of us got together and we said, well, things aren't really working as well as they could. How could we improve it? And we realized there was almost a battle in terms of the mindset between modernizers and traditionalists. So we took that through a number of iterations, including, our first full guild, which is the Cloud Engineers Guild in 2018. We then tried to grow it and specialize a bit too quickly, and it fell apart. So we really reinvented it with our Cloud Acceleration Guild. And then in about this time last year, we reinvented ourselves as the Centrica Guild Network, where we tried to specialize, but actually became a bit more mainstream. And now we're a thriving part of the overall strategy. So the interesting thing about this is that it did require tenacity, because what we found is from that initial group of 3 of us to actually now we're really, a force to be reckoned with in terms of helping the organization transform. It took a number of iterations, and there were ebbs and flows along the way. And it's a little bit like effectively the scaling up of the, actually forming, validating, growing, scaling up a startup. In as much as maybe in the early stages, there's some good idea, but we need some additional funds and investment to kind of keep it going until it's at a point that it can actually establish itself. So with that regard, forming guilds and running them is a bit like there's a mixture of organic and inorganic growth. So inorganic growth is basically, the founders, people like myself, putting in the hours to keep it going. So in the early stages, for example, it worked really well, and then when we tried to grow it, we grew it too quickly. We'd have some guild calls where nobody would turn up, and I would feel like a failure. And other ones where there'd be 30 people, and it was like, hooray! And it was basically actually dealing with those troughs took the inorganic elements, but when they were removed, what we ended up with is organic growth. And now people are forming guilds without me even knowing about it, even as the founder. So it's basically bedded in to the extent, rather like when we launch an IPO for a company, that's actually now the guild mindset and movement is self-sustaining. Here's some of our guilds. We've got around a dozen actually. So, but we've grown out of IT. So we've started, we have a culture guild that's been running almost a year called Culture Corner, where we talk about all sorts of elements around culture, psychological safety, trust, different forms of leadership like mode 2 leadership, servant leadership, what that might mean, even neurodiversity and obviously diversity and inclusion more generally. One of our most knockabout guilds is DevOps and mode 2, and there's lots of very robust debate about how we accelerate DevOps. We've got a guild that's only a few weeks old around employee development, where we're looking at actually taking employee development and partnering with HR. We've got a guild around Scrum Masters. We're talking about guilds for product owners at the moment that are going to be launched. We've got a guild around, the ServiceNow platform and a number of other topics. So what we're really able to do is to just like form these relatively spontaneously with a group of interested people to try and forward the aims. So what are some of the highlights and lowlights? Well, lowlights is actually getting a whole movement, almost a transformational movement off the ground, can be a lot of work. And I have had stages where I personally have burnt out and I've said, look, I need a break from this. I've chaired, facilitated hundreds of these sessions now over the last couple of years or so, and sometimes there was if I've done like 5 or 6 a week and they're all quite lively and everything, it's like, yeah, I need a break. Controlling strong voices is often a challenge. Sometimes we have people that have a lot of good things to say, but they can dominate, and how we kind of keep their enthusiasm but try and temper it so everybody else gets a chance, can be a real challenge. There are also sometimes challenges with rejection, as I said, when I've been on calls and nobody's turned up or it's not really working. And, you're always going to find that when you create something new, that it won't work always in the short term. You have to measure success maybe in the longer term. Very occasionally we get a problem with toxicity, but it's very, very rare. But very occasionally we'll get, because it's more of a loose structure, some people will take advantage, but that doesn't really happen very much. And if we look at the highlights, they're far larger. We've got outside speakers in. We've actually introduced into the lexicon of the organization terms like psychological safety and unconscious bias and hidden narratives, things that were out there. We've really dealt with, addressing elephants in the room. We've been able to crowdsource. I work sometimes, my day job sometimes is as an enterprise architect. I now get to, crowdsource a lot of my work, and the stuff I do, it gets adopted because actually it wasn't mine. It was something I crowdsourced from the guild. So we're able to use it as a real vehicle for change and for networking. And we're growing our influence. We're actually now quite a powerful force in the organization, almost a quasi-organization within an organization. And we have official sponsorship. And indeed, while we started at grassroots, we've gone all the way up to the C-suite now, is involved in the guild. And one of my favorite moments, in terms of dealing with elephants in the room, we were able to, for example, deal with one of our C-suites about the fact that they had, and excuse my language, resting bitch face, and they were concerned that people weren't talking to them more. And we were able to kind of say within a guild, we were able to say, well, look, it's actually maybe you're giving off the wrong vibe. So it was able, and that was, that's pretty surprising. But the interesting thing, it was that because once we're in the guild space, it's basically, well, as I said, job titles and things, it's kind of, they don't apply anymore. We're people together. It's almost like a support group. And that equalizing force means people it brings the best out of people, I find. So really the advantages of guilds are that we can create them at will. We can delete them at will. We can mess around with them. We don't have to talk to anybody. There doesn't need to be an org chart change. There's no permission or budget. We borrow a little bit of each people's time. Maybe it's coming off a CapEx or an OpEx, but it's basically we're just borrowing a little bit of people's time to volunteers. It's hugely empowering. Once people are in the guilds, it almost creates a movement. People are able to swarm. It really does build those relationships, and it reduces the barriers to collaboration. We can even do some things like Truth and Reconciliation Commission, where we can actually break down why people aren't getting on well or why they think they were hard done by. So we can also catch things that the formal organisation is missing, because we have that bandwidth at the practitioner level at the grassroots, and we've got basically a slot every week where we can work on making the organization better. So we're not really constrained by the status quo. We can actually accelerate the transformation of the organization within this construct. So really, if you like, we're an agility startup. It's about agile mindset, but really expressed through an organizational construct. And that's really our story.
Thank you very much, Chris. Really, really interesting there to hear about how the guilds have been set up and established. So we have a question from Pradeep. He says, so are these guilds similar to communities of practice?
Yeah, absolutely they are. They're fairly broad. So it's really, because they're run by the membership, Pradeep, it depends on what the membership brings. So some of them will be very much that they have a particular objective in mind. So we had one about community practice around Scrum Masters, for example, where they'll look at equalizing how best practice throughout that particular team. How can they raise standards? How can they learn from each other? That sort of thing. Other guilds are a bit more speculative, where we're just trying to make sense of things. So, for example, our DevOps and Mode 2 guild, we're getting towards being a community of practice, but in the early stages, maybe a year ago, it was all about just trying to get people on the same page. So what we found is actually getting to the community of practice stage, maybe it needed to pass through that initial phase.
And we're bringing in the other speakers. I know, Shay, you had a question for Chris in the comments.
Hi, Chris. Great presentation. Just a question around Centrica. So I just wanted to understand how truly agile are Centrica, because obviously you've got lots of programs that are happening. You're going to have a multitude of suppliers. So in this autonomous approach for scaling agile, how agile are Centrica and their suppliers?
I would say extremely and not at all, depending on where you look. So we have that it goes back to the as I said, the 5 challenges we face. It's extremely uneven. So that's one of the challenges, is we've got people that are literally public speakers when it comes to agile and DevOps and cloud and things like that. We've had people talk about talk at Reinvent. A lot of the stuff we do is really at the forefront, all the way to people who don't know what cloud is, and so therefore the issue is the unevenness, and also things like how we scale agile and how we bring more of the how we get greater levels of autonomy. And we're in that's obviously work in progress, is actually to make the organizational structure match the if you like, Shay, I just need to turn off my right, okay, for some reason Mic turn off. Dismiss. Okay, sorry about that. So I think it's to do with our ability to accelerate agility now is not that we don't know how to do it. It's that the organization needs to fit the vision. We've got enough people with the mindset. We've actually cracked some things. So for example, the stuff we're doing with the guilds, actually, we're probably ahead of the market for like traditional corporates trying to modernize. There's plenty of people that haven't succeeded in the way that we have. But in terms of our legacy, as any large organization will tell you, it's maybe a bit harder than if we were just a startup running in Shoreditch. And again, one could argue, do you need guilds if you were a startup? It's maybe the sweet spot is really about probably about scale and the scale of the challenge.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks a lot, Chris.
Amaya, do you have a question to ask? You're on mute, by the way.
I'm back. Sorry about that. Thank you, Chris, for your presentation. I was saying it was beautiful. And also, congratulations on getting the guilds created without your knowledge. That is a sign of success, as I think Sharon commented as well on the channel. But do you have any tips? Can you share any tips on how you got people engaged initially and how you go through those stages in which you are on your own in the guild, nobody has turned up to the point that now they create on their own?
Absolutely, Amaya. So it's really, really easy. You join people who are unhappy together. You put unhappy customers in front of underperforming suppliers, and it just happens. So you need the elephants in the room. So if you've got people that are saying, I want to modernize in the cloud, but effectively the governance police won't let me. You put the two people in the room and you say, now no longer are you the governance police or the people wanting to innovate. You're just peers in a room. Now let's see if we can sort it out. And it's really powered by. So that's the beautiful thing about it, because the more broken things are, the more there is to disagree and talk about. So the more energy you have. So it's a bit like a martial art in a way, and I blog about this and I've talked about it. It's a bit like a martial art because it's like judo. The more momentum there is around people, it's not really working. The more energy we have to fire solving it, but it needs the context of the guilds, which is about, it's different here. It's psychological safety. It's not about me telling you what to do or you telling me what to do, or that's my job or your job. It's let's just talk it through as peers. And that's the beautiful thing about it, is that the more broken you are, the better it will work.
Thank you.
Can I ask a question as well to Chris? Quick one. Chris, fantastic presentation. I really enjoyed it. What's an application of guilds, let's say, in daily activities in the organization? You spoke about it. You touched around strategy, but what type of involvement have guilds on a day-to-day running of the business?
So it's a great question. So for example, Manuel, we've got a Mode 2 and DevOps guild, and specifically what we're talking about is the things day to day that's blocking people the most. So what we try and do is take things from the everyday, and this is what it's different from maybe more of a strategy-based approach. It's very practitioner-based. So what we'll have is people will bring their problems of the day in, and for example, I've just come off a session earlier, which is our Mode 2 DevOps guild, where we were talking about levels of autonomy and how can people, what are the guardrails, how much autonomy do people get on decision making? And we were basically working out, and there were different parties. Some thought a bit more, some thought a bit less, but it was clearly that the addressing that needed to happen in order for us to move forward. So we needed to get some agreement. So what we're doing is we're taking things that are hurting people right now, pulling those into the guild and saying, what can we do about it? Which is why, for example, in our Culture Corner, we've been talking a lot about Black Lives Matter and diversity and inclusion. Whereas like 6 months ago, before all the George Floyd stuff kicked off, we were talking more about type 2 leadership and empathy. So it's basically, what we do is we're influenced by the news cycle and what's topical, and that makes it relevant and engaging for people, but it also means people get something practical out of it, so it feels like it's, you know, in tune with the organization.
Thank you.
Cool. We just have one more question from the comments. So Maps Compass, do guilds have MOPs/KPIs, or have they been asked for?
Yes, or yes and no, I would say. So some people like a more formal approach. Some people like a more informal approach. So, for example, guilds generally don't have agendas, because actually we want it to be a bit scrappy. But what happens is the scrappiness can be quite helpful. The disorganization can be quite helpful when people aren't on the same page. But once we get some consensus, then we need to say, okay, well, we broadly know where everybody sits. What are we going to do about it? And it's that point that we need, you know, the terms of reference, articles of association, mission statements, objectives, the KPIs. Even, you know, we've even had some guilds have had their own manifesto. We've even had some guilds have had their own Kanban boards and stuff. But what we found is it needs to actually be based around the actual needs. So the closer we are to actually actioning things, we can introduce the formality. But if everybody's, you know, if everything's on fire and nobody can disagree, then actually sometimes the last thing you need is an action or a structured approach. Sometimes you need to just let it work itself out to try and, you know, provoke an empathy response from people. So people, you know, so that's the thing. It probably depends on how near or far apart people are, how close they are to actually action. But that's always the trend, is to introduce the structure.